Science loves acting like it has everything figured out. Spoiler alert, it doesn't. Experts spent centuries insisting that rocks couldn't fall from space because that would be ridiculous. Continents moving? Please. One guy got mocked his entire career for an idea that turned out to be spot on, and he passed away before anyone bothered to apologize. I'm Mike with List 25, and these are 25 moments when science admitted it was wrong. 25. Junk DNA was not junk. Geneticists spent decades looking at human DNA and basically shrugging at 98% of it. Only a tiny fraction codes for proteins, so researchers figured the rest was useless garbage left over from evolution. They literally called it junk DNA. Not exactly a term of endearment for most of your genetic code. That assumption aged terribly. Better technology revealed that all this supposed junk was actually doing important work behind the scenes, regulating genes, influencing how cells behave, playing roles in diseases that scientists hadn't connected before. Projects like ENCODE blew the doors open on just how wrong the original assessment had been. Turns out, slapping the label useless on something you don't understand isn't great science. The field had to completely rethink what the genome actually does, and what was once dismissed as clutter is now considered essential machinery. 98% of your DNA deserves a better nickname. 24. The Milky Way is not the entire universe. Back in the early 1900s, astronomers were pretty confident they had the universe mapped out. Everything that existed was inside the Milky Way. Those fuzzy spiral blobs people get spotting through telescopes? Just gas clouds, nothing special. Our galaxy was the whole show, and that was that. Edwin Hubble destroyed that idea completely. He started studying certain stars in what everyone assumed was the Andromeda gas cloud and realized something didn't add up. These stars pulsed in predictable ways that let him calculate distance, and the math said Andromeda was way too far away to be inside our galaxy. It wasn't a cloud at all. It was a completely separate galaxy, and suddenly the universe became a whole lot bigger. Astronomers had to throw out their entire sense of scale overnight. One galaxy became billions, stretching across distances nobody had seriously considered before. The whole field of extragalactic astronomy exists because Hubble proved everyone was using the wrong measuring stick. 23. The arsenic life that wasn't. NASA really swung for the fences with this one. In 2010, they called a press conference to announce that researchers had found bacteria in California's Mono Lake doing something impossible. These microbes were supposedly swapping out phosphorus for arsenic in their DNA, which would have meant life could run on completely different chemistry than anyone thought possible. Other scientists were skeptical immediately, and for good reason. Labs everywhere tried replicating the result and kept striking out. The bacteria weren't actually building their genetic material from arsenic, they were just tolerating trace amounts of it while surviving on regular old phosphorus like everything else. The journal Science officially pulled the paper in July 2025. 15 years of controversy, and it ended with a retraction. The researchers still stand by their work, but pretty much nobody else does. The whole saga became a textbook example of why you probably shouldn't hold a press conference before your findings can survive peer review. 22. Polywater turned out to be sweat. The Cold War made people competitive about everything, including weird chemistry. Soviet scientists in the 60s started reporting that they'd made a strange new form of water. It boiled at higher temperatures, froze at lower ones, and had this thick, syrupy consistency. They called it polywater, and Western researchers absolutely need to know what was going on. Labs across America and Europe started making their own batches. And the weird part is that it seemed to work. People got the same bizarre readings the Soviets had reported. Funding materialized, serious papers got published. Some folks started wondering if this stuff might revolutionize everything from industry to weapons development. Then, someone actually checked the samples carefully and found the boring truth. The unusual readings came from contamination. Sweat, grease from equipment, and residue from glass tubes. All of it had been mixing into the water and skewing the results. Once labs started keeping things properly clean, Polywater vanished. It was never a new form of matter, just dirty water, and a whole lot of embarrassment. 21. N-rays were never there. French physicist René Blanlot thought he discovered something huge in 1903, a brand new type of radiation that could make things more visible and affect certain materials in measurable ways. He named it N-rays after his university in Nancy, and the scientific community ate it up. Researchers across Europe started replicating his findings. Papers piled up, careers launched. Then, American physicist Robert Wood decided to pay Blanlot's lab a visit. During one demonstration, Wood quietly pocketed a crucial component from the equipment without anyone noticing. The device physically couldn't produce N-rays anymore. The French team kept reporting positive results anyway. The whole thing was in their heads. Scientists were seeing exactly what they expected to see, even when there was literally nothing there. N-rays joined the history books as one of the most famous cases of observer bias wrecking an entire field of research. Blanlot went to his grave insisting the rays were real. They weren't. 20. The Stanford prison experiment was flawed. Psychology students have been learning this for decades. Take regular college kids, assign some to be guards and others to be prisoners, and watch ordinary people turn cruel when you give them power. The 1971 Stanford prison experiment seemed to prove that situations shape behavior more than personality does. It became one of the most cited studies in the field. Except, the whole thing was a mess. Later investigations found that the lead researcher had been coaching participants on how to act. Guards were encouraged to be harsh. Proper scientific controls didn't exist. The data got cherry-picked to support conclusions that were basically decided in advance. When other researchers tried running similar experiments, they couldn't reproduce the dramatic results. The study is still taught today, but the lesson changed. Now it's an example of how badly research can go wrong when the person running it has already decided what they want to find. Turns out the most famous psychology experiment was also one of the sloppiest. 19. The first Americans weren't who we thought. Anthropology had a clean story for most of the 20th century. The first humans in the Americas were the Clovis people, who walked over from Asia on a land bridge roughly 13,000 years ago. Their stone tools showed up everywhere, and that settled it. Anyone suggesting an earlier timeline got ignored. Then, sites started popping up that broke the narrative. Monteverde in Chile had clear evidence of human habitation going back at least 14,500 years. People were living at the southern tip of South America before the Clovis culture even existed up north. More pre-Clovis sites followed, and the old model fell apart. Anthropology had to admit it had been way too rigid. The current thinking involves multiple waves of migration, probably including coastal routes that would explain how people spread so quickly. Indigenous history in the Americas goes back further than textbooks have taught for generations, and the field is still updating its understanding. 18. GDP doesn't measure what matters. Economists treated gross domestic product like a sacred scoreboard for decades. If the number went up, the country was winning. Politicians built campaigns around it. Policies were designed to juice it. Questioning whether GDP actually meant anything useful felt almost taboo. Reality eventually caught up. GDP doesn't care if all the gains go to billionaires while everyone else falls behind. Environmental destruction doesn't register at all. Neither does unpaid work like raising kids or caring for elderly parents. A country can post fantastic growth numbers while most of its population gets worse off, and GDP won't blink. Economists finally started admitting what critics had said for years. The metric misses too much to be the final word on anything. Alternatives like the Human Development Index gained ground as people realized that measuring success requires actually looking at whether lives are improving. GDP still matters, but it's no longer treated like the only thing that does. 17. Malaria wasn't caused by bad air. The name gives away what people used to believe. Malaria comes from Italian words meaning bad air. For centuries, doctors blamed swamps and marshes for making people sick. Toxic vapors rose from the water and got in your lungs, and well, that was that. Some physicians tried fighting the disease with mercury treatments, which went about as well as you'd expect. Alphonse Laveran figured out the real answer in 1880 by doing something radical. He looked through a microscope. There, swimming around inside the red blood cells of infected patients, were parasites. No mysterious vapors, no swamp gases, just tiny organisms that had been hiding in plain sight the whole time. Ronald Ross later proved that mosquitoes spread the parasite between people, and suddenly, the whole approach to fighting malaria changed. Public health programs stopped worrying about air quality and started focusing on the bugs actually transmitting the disease. Centuries of wrong guesses got overturned by one guy who actually bothered to look closely. 16. Earthquakes follow patterns. Early earthquake science didn't have much to offer. The ground shook, buildings collapsed, people suffered, and that was pretty much it. Predicting where or when these things might happen seemed impossible because they appeared to strike randomly. One place got hit, then somewhere completely different, with no obvious logic connecting them. Better data changed everything. Once scientists could track seismic activity globally, patterns emerged. Earthquakes cluster along specific fault lines and plate boundaries. Certain regions face dramatically higher odds than others, and those odds can be calculated with decent accuracy. The randomness turned out to be an illusion created by incomplete information. Modern seismology can't tell you exactly when the next big one will hit, but it can tell you where to worry most and roughly how often major events happen in those areas. Building codes, evacuation plans, and urban development all benefit from treating earthquakes as statistically predictable rather than acts of pure chaos. 15. Mendel's data looked too perfect. Grigel Mendel's pea experiment basically invented genetics. He crossed plants, tracked traits through generations, and produced results that laid the foundation for everything that came after. His work sat forgotten for decades before being rediscovered in 1900, and then it became gospel. Statistician R.A. Fisher took a hard look at those numbers in 1936 and noticed something fishy. The data matched theoretical predictions almost exactly. Too exactly. Results that are statistically weird. And Fisher publicly accused Mendel of fudging things, whether intentionally or not. The debate lasted decades. Did Mendel cheat? Did his assistants throw out results that looked wrong? Or did Fisher's analysis miss something? Later, researchers mostly concluded that Mendel was probably fine. Small sample sizes and experimental choices could explain the suspicious tidiness without assuming fraud. His conclusions held up, even if the path there was messier than the published numbers suggested. 14. The Himalayan fossils were planted. Vishwajit Gupta had quite a career. Between the 60s and 80s, this Indian paleontologist published hundreds of papers describing fossil discoveries from the Himalayas. His work supposedly rewrote the understanding of ancient plate tectonics and species distribution. Other researchers cited him constantly. Australian geologist John Tallant became suspicious and started digging in 1987. What he found was ugly. Gupta's Himalayan fossils were identical to specimens from Morocco, Tunisia, and parts of Europe, regions with zero geological connection to where the fossils supposedly came from. They'd been planted, mislabeled, or invented entirely. The scandal torched Gupta's reputation and damaged trust in Himalayan paleontology for years. People started calling him the Houdini of the Himalayas for his ability to make fake fossils appear legitimate for so long. Peer review had completely failed to catch decades of fraud from someone the system trusted. 13. Haeckel's embryos were exaggerated. Ernst Haeckel's embryo drawings spent over a century in biology textbooks. The 19th century illustrations showed vertebrate embryos looking nearly identical in early development, supposedly proving that organisms replay their evolutionary history as they grow. Generations of students learned from these images. The problem was that Haeckel had taken some creative liberties. He cherry-picked developmental stages that supported his argument and ignored ones that didn't. He smoothed out differences to make embryos look more similar than they actually were. The drawings weren't complete fabrications, but they weren't honest either. Biology eventually stopped treating Haeckel's illustrations as accurate science. They still get discussed, but now as a cautionary tale about confirmation bias in scientific illustration. What got presented as an objective observation turned out to be heavily shaped by what the artist wanted to prove, proving that sometimes the pictures in your textbooks are lying to you. 12. The GM potato study couldn't hold up. Arpad Pushtai kicked off a firestorm in the late 90s when he went on television claiming that genetically modified potatoes damaged the immune systems of lab rats. He announced this before peer review was even finished, and public panic about genetically modified food safety exploded overnight. Scientists who looked at his actual methodology found problems everywhere. The controls were sloppy, he didn't use nearly enough rats to draw any real conclusions, variables that had nothing to do with genetic modification hadn't been properly ruled out. Independent reviewers concluded that the data couldn't support the scary claims being made. The work was never formally retracted, but the scientific community rejected it thoroughly. Pustai thought he was protecting consumers from dangerous foods. What he actually did was muddy public understandings of GM safety for years with a study that couldn't survive basic scrutiny. Good intentions don't fix bad methodology. 11. Science caught its own mistake. Pamela Ronald built a solid reputation in studying how rice defends itself against bacterial infections. Her work on a gene called XA21 influenced the field for years and got cited in papers everywhere. Then, in 2013, she did something most researchers wouldn't. She retracted 2 of her own influential papers. New people in her lab couldn't get the same results when they ran the old experiments again. After a year and a half of digging, they figured out that bacterial strains had been mislabeled the whole time, throwing off major conclusions. Ronald went public with the whole process instead of burying it. She walked everyone through exactly what went wrong and made a point about being open when you mess up. Later work confirmed the corrected version of her discoveries. The episode showed science functioning exactly as it should. When you find errors, you fix the record. That kind of honesty is rare in academia, and people noticed. 10. The Tumor study used the wrong rats. In 2012, Gieric Seralini published a study with alarming photos of tumor-covered rats that had been fed genetically modified corn and Roundup herbicide. Media coverage went nuts. Public concern about GM foods spiked immediately because those images were genuinely disturbing. Scientists pushed back hard once they examined the details. The rat strain Seralini used develops tumors at high rates, no matter what you feed them. That's just what those rats do. Sample sizes were too small to draw meaningful conclusions. The experimental design made it impossible to pin any effects specifically on genetic modification. The journal retracted the paper in 2013 for having inconclusive results. Seralini published elsewhere with more data, but the damage to the conversation around GM food was already done. Scary pictures make great headlines, they just don't prove causation. 9. Rocks really do fall from the sky. 18th century scientists were absolutely certain about this one. Rocks cannot fall from the sky because there are no rocks up there to fall. When farmers and villagers reported stones crashing to Earth, educated experts dismissed them as superstitious yokels who didn't understand how the world worked. Museums threw out meteorite samples rather than accept something so obviously impossible. The 1803 meteorite shower at L'Aigle, France, made denial pretty difficult. Thousands of stones rained down in broad daylight across a populated area. The government sent chemist Jean-Baptiste Biot to investigate, and his analysis proved beyond doubt that these rocks came from somewhere beyond Earth. Science had to eat a big plate of humble pie on this one. The superstitious peasants had been right all along. Meteorites became a legitimate field of study and eventually helped scientists understand everything from planetary formations to how organic compounds might have first arrived on Earth. 8. The Martian canals were an optical illusion. Astronomers in the late 1800s started reporting something wild on Mars. Linear features that looked unnaturally straight, almost like they'd been engineered. Italian astronomer Giovanni Schiaparelli called them canali, which English speakers translated as canals, and suddenly everyone was talking about intelligent Martians who had built an irrigation system visible from Earth. The idea stuck around for decades. Authors wrote books about dying Martian civilizations struggling against a drying planet. Observatories worldwide pointed telescopes at Mars, and plenty of astronomers confirmed seeing the same patterns Schiaparelli had described. An entire mythology grew around these supposed structures. Better telescopes eventually killed the fantasy. The canals were optical illusions. Early telescope limitations, combined with the human brain's tendency to connect scattered dots into lines, had created something that was never actually there. Mars turned out to have plenty of interesting geology, but none of it was built by anyone. 7. Eugenics was never real science. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, prominent scientists, politicians, and academics pushed the idea that humanity could be improved through selective breeding. Encourage people with desirable traits to have children, prevent those deemed unfit for reproducing. The language sounded scientific. Universities taught it. Governments implemented it. Tens of thousands of people were forcibly sterilized because experts decided their genes weren't worth passing on. Immigration policies restricted who could enter countries based on eugenic reasoning. The whole movement had an air of scientific authority that made horrific policies seem rational. Modern genetics proved the entire foundation was nonsense. Traits like intelligence aren't simple enough to breed for the way eugenicists imagined. The movement is now recognized as pseudoscience that gave discrimination a respectable mask. Science lent its credibility to something that was never actually scientific, and people suffered for generations because of it. 6. The physics data was fabricated. German physicist Emil Rupp published important quantum physics experiments throughout the 1930s. His work on light and interference patterns got cited everywhere. Other researchers built on his findings as they developed their understanding of how particles behave at tiny scales. Problems surfaced when other labs tried running the same experiments and kept getting different results. Inconsistencies in Rupp's data raised eyebrows. Eventually, the investigation revealed the uncomfortable truth. Rupp had been making things up. The celebrated physicist had fabricated his experimental results. Multiple papers got retracted, and physics had to acknowledge that fake data had been steering parts of the field for years. The Rupp affair became a reminder of why replication matters so much. Trusting that everyone is being honest isn't a scientific method. Checking their work is. 5. Galileo got the tides wrong. Galileo Galilei spent years fighting to prove that Earth revolves around the sun, and he thought he'd found the perfect evidence in ocean tides. His theory went like this. Water sloshes back and forth because the planet is simultaneously rotating and orbiting, like liquid in a bowl being carried across a room. It was clever, and it supported the heliocentric model he was championing. One problem, though, the explanation was completely wrong. Tides happen because of gravitational pull from the moon and sun, not planetary motion sloshing things around. The bowl analogy doesn't describe what's actually going on, at all. Galileo ended up being right about heliocentrism, but wrong about his proof for it. Science eventually figured out the actual mechanics of tides, which had nothing to do with the argument he was making. Even geniuses can reach correct conclusions through faulty reasoning. 4. The Pulsar signal came from the equipment. When a supernova went off in the Large Magellanic Cloud in 1987, astronomers rushed to study the aftermath. Someone picked up rapid radio pulses that seemed to come from a newly formed pulsar, a fast-spinning neutron star. This was exciting because it offered a chance to watch one of these objects right after formation. The signal was definitely real. Instruments were picking something up, and researchers published findings based on it. Theories started forming about what this new pulsar might teach us about how massive stars collapse. Turns out, the signal was coming from inside the telescope. Electrical interference in the guide camera electronics had been generating pulses that looked like cosmic data. Once the equipment was fixed, the mysterious pulsar disappeared entirely. The universe hadn't provided a new discovery, a glitchy camera had fooled everyone. 3. Atoms don't look like plum pudding. After J.J. Thomson discovered electrons in 1897, he needed a way to explain atomic structure. His idea pictured atoms as blobs of positive charge with negative electrons scattered throughout, sort of like plum stuck in a pudding. It fit what scientists knew at the time and seemed reasonable enough. Ernest Rutherford blew that model apart in 1909. His team fired particles at thin gold foil, expecting them to pass straight through with maybe some minor deflections. Most did exactly that, but some bounced back at wild angles, which shouldn't happen if atoms were uniform blobs of charge. Something small and dense had to be sitting at the center. Thomson's elegant pudding collapsed almost overnight. Atoms have a tiny, heavy nucleus surrounded by electrons. Physics had to completely rebuild its picture of matter from scratch, all because a few particles bounced the wrong way. 2. Water does not have memory. French immunologist Jacques Benveniste dropped a bombshell in 1988. He claimed that water could somehow remember substances that had been diluted out of existence. Even after you diluted something so many times that not a single molecule remained, the water retained some imprint of what used to be there. If true, homeopathy would suddenly make sense, and chemistry would need a complete overhaul. Other scientists tried replicating the results and hit walls everywhere. The experiments had problems. Controls weren't adequate. Observer bias crept in. The findings fell apart under scrutiny. The scientific community ultimately rejected water memory entirely. The effect wasn't real, and Benveniste's work became a go-to example of why extraordinary claims need extraordinary evidence. Water is just water. Diluting something until nothing remains leaves you with nothing but water. Chemistry got to keep its existing rules. 1. Continents really do drift. And finally, for our last entry, we're heading back about a century, to a time when geologists were absolutely certain that continents stayed put, the ground under your feet was permanent, land masses didn't wander around. Suggesting otherwise was ridiculous. Alfred Wegener thought that was nonsense. He pointed out that Africa and South America fit together like jigsaw pieces. Fossil distributions made more sense if continents had been once connected. He proposed that land masses drift across the planet over millions of years. The scientific establishment treated him like a crank. Wegener couldn't explain what force would push continents around, so his theory got dismissed as speculation. He died in 1930 on an expedition to Greenland, still considered a joke by most of his colleagues. Decades later, ocean floor mapping vindicated him completely. Mid-ocean ridges, magnetic striping, and seafloor spreading, all of it proved that the ground does move. Slowly, but constantly. Plate tectonics became the foundation of modern geology, and Wegener finally got credit for being right. He just wasn't alive to see it happen. Science gets things wrong all the time, but weirdly, that's kind of the point. Somebody floats an idea, other people poke holes in it, and eventually the picture sharpens. The problem isn't making mistakes. It's refusing to fix them when the evidence shows up. If you want to see how this works in reverse, click here for 25 superstitions that science has proven true. Turns out, some of those old beliefs were onto something after all. As always, don't forget to like, share, comment, subscribe with that notification bell, and I'll catch you in the next one. See ya.